Hola, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos al chapter de Rasa Madrid. Hoy, como habíamos anunciado, pues haremos una sesión técnica sobre Rasa X. Y, perdona, me he quitado los cascos porque me oía ahora como tengo en diferido el YouTube con unos segundos de retraso porque me resultaba un poco extraño. Como sabéis, tenemos a una experta de Rasa que se ha ofrecido a darnos una sesión técnica sobre Rasa X. Se llama Mady Mantha, es Senior Evangelist en Rasa. Anteriormente ha sido directora de proyectos de IA en una compañía allí en Estados Unidos. Ella es de Estados Unidos, de Boston. Actualmente trabajo con la gente de Rasa desde Dallas. Así que espero que os resulte interesante esta sesión y que podamos construir nuevos agentes contextuales mucho más eficientes gracias a la ayuda de Mady. Así que no quiero contar nada más porque lo importante es Mady, que nos cuente cómo podemos desarrollar con Rasa X de una forma eficiente, que podamos construir nuestros agentes contextuales lo más chulos posibles y que podamos enseñarle a nuestros clientes la diferencia de lo que es hacer algo bien hecho con Rasa a utilizar otro tipo de plataformas. Así que adelante, Mady. Thank you, Mady. I've been presenting you. Thank you very much to be here in this meetup. So we expect a lot from you, from Rasa X. So we are very glad to be with you today. So let's start whenever you want.
Okay, great. Well, Rafael, thank you for the introduction. I think I got a little bit of that. I think like we were talking about earlier, I only took high school Spanish, so I caught very little, but thank you for having me. And thanks to everyone for coming out today. If this meetup were in person, we'd ideally chat before the event, get to know each other. So I'd still love to get to know all of you. If you want to post in the chat, say hello, that'd be great. I'm Mady Mantha. I'm a senior technical evangelist at Rasa. So before Rasa, I did some interesting work at a think tank with co-reference and probabilistic graphical models. Then I worked for Blender and a couple of other startups where my role evolved from doing strictly machine learning research to doing some machine learning engineering too. So pipelining machine learning models, working on the entire ML lifecycle. And then I worked for a couple of enterprises where I did similar projects, but more on the engineering side of machine learning. And now at Rasa, I focus on developer education. I work on tutorials, blogs, videos, a podcast that I co-host, and I also give talks. I also develop and launch courses, so it's a lot of fun, especially when I get to chat with members of the community and Rasa users and developers and watch them come up with new and interesting ways to use the product. So a quick roadmap for today. We'll walk through some slides together for the first half, and then we'll take a look at Rasa X. I'll provide some scripts to install Rasa X if that's something you want to do today, right now with me. And then we'll take a look at what you can do with it, how you can use it to build resilient, production-grade assistants that actually help users and teams. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the types of AI assistants, because not all AI assistants are the same, right? Similar to the 5 levels of autonomous driving, where you have different levels of driving automation, AI assistants, the way we see it, have, these 5 levels too. There are some assistants that are basic command line tools, and some that can handle multi-turn natural interactions and actually handle dialogue. And these 5 levels of AI assistants can be explained by their capabilities. But the driving force behind these levels, and really behind building AI assistants, is that conversational AI allows you to interact with technology the way we interact with each other. It's natural, intuitive, seamless, doesn't need onboarding, right? Without any barriers to entry. That last part is important because you don't have to be a machine learning scientist or a researcher to build AI assistants. You shouldn't have to be a technical expert to use technology. So on a high level, the TLDR version, we have 2 perspectives. We have both the developer perspective and the end user perspective. And at level 1, we're just putting all of the onus or all of the burden on the user to figure out how to use the chatbot. And developers are still using command line tools to create and build chatbots, right? And as we move up these levels, we're using conversation-driven development, which is a practice where we listen to users and understand them better to automate that process over time. From the end user perspective, at level 1, they have to figure out how to use the bot. But as we move up these levels, the assistant does more on the user's behalf, and users simply have to talk to the assistant. The bot has to figure out what they want, figure out what they need help with, and then execute those things on their behalf. So the driving theme is that the assistant feels more like something that's built to help us and less like an API endpoint. So we'll, quickly walk through these levels from a developer perspective, because, I'm sure all of you folks are building chatbots using Rasa, and figuring out better ways to make it better. So at level 1, you have a command line app, and it can send you notifications or perform some kind of calculations on the user's behalf. And it's very easy for the developer to add new functionality because it's just changing some code and really not giving it much thought into making it easier or seamless for end users. And at this stage, you have traditional notification assistance, or you might have something like a mortgage calculator on a website. And at level 2, you have a basic chatbot, right? You can ask the assistant a simple question, expect a pre-built response. It can even handle some basic back and forth, but everything is just rule-based and powered by if-else statements or state machines. At this point, end users still have to do a fair amount of work, but for developers, it gets harder and harder to maintain lots of rules as the project scope increases, because as developers, we have to continue to cater to those edge cases with those if-else conditions and ensure that things don't break as we keep adding new functionality. And so this is the most common type of assistant that we see today, and this is how we get started when we build a chatbot. And at level 3, we have contextual assistance. The idea is that the user can do things like ask for clarification. They can correct themselves or change their mind without confusing the bot. The user still has to know exactly what their goal is. If you're trying to build a help desk assistant or a financial banking assistant, the user still has to know that the goal of the chatbot is to maybe open tickets on their behalf, or pay a credit card bill or something like that. But users no longer have to know exactly how to use the assistant to avoid breaking the conversation. And as developers, it's our job to accommodate this type of situation so that users don't think about the problems the same way that developers do, and that not every message is an intent. We still need to observe how users are talking and use those insights to teach the assistant how to talk to the users. So we need to practice something called conversation-driven development, which we'll go into detail, and then we'll use Rasa X to figure out how to do that. And at level 4, you have consultative assistants, right? They're much more flexible, so the user can express their situation in their own terms. They can say things like, hey, I'm not able to send an email, or I have too many meetings today. And as a developer, this is what we like to think of as ambiguous input, right? But if it's a level 4 assistant, the bot should figure out what they can do to help the user. Okay, you have too many meetings today, so as an office assistant, I'm going to try to see if I can clear your calendar. If you have too many meetings today, can I help reschedule some of them, or something like that? So at level 4, we start to automate parts of the CDD process, automatically find which conversations were successful, figure out which ones fail, and automatically turn these successful conversations into new training data, into new end-to-end tests, and point the developer exactly to the mistakes they should fix to further improve the assistant. Level 5 assistants are adaptive assistants. So they should be able to tease out, more details from the end user based on what they're looking for and adjust accordingly. Maybe users simply want to open a ticket, or maybe they want to ask the assistant quite directly, hey, clear my calendar. Or maybe they don't know what they're looking for yet, and they're trying to ask the assistant for a way to solve their problem. The assistant in all of these situations should be able to figure it out and adjust its behavior accordingly, from like a simple FAQ assistant to something more helpful and consultative. But the idea is that at each of these levels, we're lowering the burden on the user to translate what they want. As developers at this level, we're technically capable of fully automating conversation-driven development or the chatbot lifecycle. So if we wanted to add new capabilities, we can provide the business logic for that task completion. And with just a few sample conversations, the assistant can complete this new task effectively. Even though we can do all of that, we still want to retain some human, some possibility for human supervision and involvement, because even though we can automate it, we still want to identify and root out problematic behavior. We still want to identify abusive behavior and things like that. So overall, the developer's role evolved from working on ad hoc code, making very quick ad hoc changes and catering to edge cases, and figuring out a way to architect this entire system and automate this process. So what do you need when you're building production grade level 3 AI assistants, right? If you've built an AI assistant before, which I'm sure you've done because you're part of the community chapter here in Madrid, you'll know that it's not easy. It's actually kind of difficult to build a really good assistant. It's easy enough to build a prototype or a simple chatbot that you can stand up in an hour, but to ship something that solves a problem, like automating 30% of conversations or decreasing cart abandonment rate or something like that, is difficult. POCs don't typically uncover the hard challenges, going to production does. And I think, in the chat earlier, Alfonso had a question around, whether or not Rasa X can work in production. And the answer is yeah. You can totally start with deploying Rasa X in local mode, and then deploy it on a server, and then use it in production. Because going to production allows you to figure out what the hard problems are, and we want to use something like Rasa X to solve them. But the way that you build really great conversational AI is you need great research, right? You need great research models for both NLU and dialogue. And just like with any other software application, conversational AI is not that much different. You need engineering best practices. So it's not enough to have the most accurate or performant model. You need solid engineering principles like CI/CD, integrated version control, maybe a microservice architecture, using something like Kubernetes or Docker and so forth. And one of the cool things about conversational AI is that users will literally tell you what they want. They'll ask the contextual assistant something in a way that you haven't trained, right? Or they'll tell you if your answer is wrong or irrelevant. So listening to users, using those insights to improve your assistant, and automating that process is conversation-driven development. And this practice is an effective way to build those robust and resilient assistants that work in production. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I also want to say, we're still kind of in the very early stages of building conversational AI, even though this is something that's been around since the 1960s. But we're still a long way away from building something that everyone can really effectively and reliably use. So in order to accomplish this, we need to find a way to bring everyone into this community so that they can contribute in a meaningful way. So you're all familiar with Rasa, right? Assuming that you've already built or in the process of building an assistant. When you create training data for your assistant, we often do that by coming up with training examples. We list out all of the ways and all of the things that we think users would probably say, and then come up with a few ways of phrasing it. So for instance, if I'm building a help desk assistant, and one of the things that the help desk assistant has to do is open a ticket, I'm gonna come up with different ways of getting at that intent, right? So I'll say, open a ticket, or can you open a ticket, or open a ticket for me today, my password's not working, and stuff like that. And that's a fine way to start, but it doesn't really reflect the real world. Because first, as the developer of this assistant, you have what you call the curse of knowledge. And that means that we know this bot so well that it's really hard for us to imagine how a user who doesn't know anything about the assistant might use it. And for another thing, we're just getting one person's perspective or one team's perspective. There's a whole world out there, of different ways that people communicate based on age, background, and other factors. So if we train the assistant based on just how we talk or how we think our users will talk, chances are the assistant is not going to perform very well when it encounters, those real users, because you can't ever anticipate how users will interact with your assistant. And the solution is to train your bot with data from real world conversations, not with training data that is made up by a developer. In fact, a best practice that we recommend at Rasa is that when you go to production, make sure not more than 10% of your training data is generated by you and your team. So, this challenge still kind of remains is, well, how exactly do you get this data and how exactly do you improve your assistant with it? And so we came up with a way to do that. And that's why we use the term conversation-driven development to explain this process and principles behind gathering and using real-world data to make your assistant better. So you still want to follow the process of listening to users, and CDD is made up of these 6 actions: share, review, annotate, test, track, and fix. And we're going to learn how to do this in Rasa X, because Rasa X is a browser-based tool that allows you to do just this. And these aren't linear actions, and you often will find yourself going back to reviewing conversations after you've annotated data, or you will continue to test things at several stages of your application. So this is not a linear process, right? Because the alternative, if you don't use CDD, is to develop your assistant for months in isolation before testing it with users, where it's most likely going to fail because, you know, when it meets real users, because we don't have all of those, we haven't anticipated all of those different conversation paths. And we end up spending a lot of time optimizing for situations and metrics that we won't need or come across, right? So only looking at top level metrics like sentiment analysis or failure rate without looking at conversations themselves is not, you know, a great way to go about things. And continuing to auto-regenerate training data that doesn't reflect all of the ways that users talk is also not a great way to doing things. And, you know, the same thing goes for pushing changes to production without running tests like unit tests, functional tests, end-to-end tests for both NLU stories and your application itself. So one of the first and most important parts of conversation-driven development is right when it starts, as early as possible in the prototype phase. When you're first developing an assistant, it's common to not have any real user conversations yet that you can use to build your training data set. So, you know, you try to come up with different ways by talking to subject matter experts. You take a look at FAQ articles and knowledge bases and try to figure out what users will ask. And based on that, come up with enough data to get you started. But once you clear that first stage of development, it becomes really important for you to send your bot out to test users and test it with real life people. And out of these conversations, you can start to build up another training data set with examples that more accurately reflect what users will say. And I can't really stress this enough. Sharing your assistant with real users should happen very early in the development process. It's definitely very tempting to wait until you think your bot is perfect before you share it with test users or real users. I get that. I try to do that all the time. But early on, assistants will make mistakes, right? But the longer you wait to share it with real users, the longer you wait to take advantage of all of this, you know, training data that's actually going to make your bot better. And if you build your assistant in a vacuum without user feedback, it can be difficult to course correct and change your design decisions later on if it turns that people are maybe using your assistant in a way that's different from what you expected. So share it with users, test users first, and then real users, give your prototype to them. And yeah, try to collect those insights. And after you collect your insights, take time to read through those conversations that people have with your assistant. This is helpful at every stage in the project, like from prototype to production. And too many users will get caught up in looking at things exclusively at metrics like what percent of my users express intent, you know, X, or what's the failure rate, or what's the sentiment, right? And that's not super helpful immediately, but looking at what users are saying, and then making those adjustments based on what they're saying can actually go a long way. The next thing you want to do is improve your NLU model based on messages from real user conversations. When you're building a POC, you can come up with examples yourselves, or you can generate hypothetical conversations and synthetic examples, and that'll help you get started like we talked about. And it's a really good way to bootstrap your chatbot. Just like rules and if-else statements help you get started, but when you're going to production, make sure that, you know, your data is not totally synthetic. And the next thing you want to do is use whole conversations as end-to-end tests for your assistant. Professional teams don't really ship applications without tests. And so it's a good way to continue to do that. Next thing you want to do is track, right? Come up with a way to identify successful conversations So these success metrics can look something like, the bot successfully answering a question, but go beyond that, right? And look at actions and other ways to identify successful conversations. For example, look at proxy measures like a user taking an action, like signing up for your service, or maybe a user doesn't take an action, like a user does not get back in touch with support within 24 hours. So take a look at these proxy measures based on what makes sense for you and your particular use case, and use that data to tag and filter conversations to understand what's working and what's not working. And then, of course, after you've done all of this, after you've collected conversations, reviewed them, you've annotated training data, you've tested it, and you're tracking all of your metrics, study conversations that went smoothly and also take a look at ones that failed. Successful conversations, ones that worked based on your metrics, can become tests right away. And you want to use end-to-end conversations as tests. And unsuccessful conversations that show you where you need more training data or where you might need to fix your code or fix your answer can also help you, right? So track the different ways your assistant fails so you know that you're reducing failures over time and you're making those fixes. So CDD overall is a user-centric approach to building AI assistants, and it requires more than just software skills. It's also not a linear process, right? Some of these actions require a deep understanding of the domain and of the end user. For instance, if you're reviewing conversations and taking a look at those, figuring out which ones are successful and which ones are really insightful will require a deep understanding of the domain and of your user. And some of these are actually going to require software or machine learning skills, like if you wanted to annotate your data, if you wanted to come up with tests and including those tests as part of your CI/CD pipeline. So it's a really collaborative process between product, design, and development team that reveals what users are actually looking for. And over time, your assistant is going to adapt to what users want rather than expecting the user to adapt to your chatbot's behavior so that the assistant doesn't break. So CDD is also a practice that you can implement regardless of the framework you use. You don't have to be using Rasa to implement CDD, but Rasa X is a tool set that makes it easier for you to do CDD because it runs in the browser. It provides a user interface that helps you test and improve your assistant. It lets you talk to your bot, correct model predictions. It just gives you a way to share your assistant even if you haven't connected it to a messaging channel so that others can take a look at it and start talking to it. Maybe friends and people on other teams can talk to it pretty easily as opposed to talking to your chatbot in the command line, right? And it gives you a way to review conversations that users have with your assistant and annotate messages and very seamlessly turn annotated messages and conversations into training data. So I'm going to pause here and take some questions now, but also I want us to try to install Rasa X together. I already have it installed. You can actually install it on your local if you're still testing it, or Alfonso, like you said, if you wanted to go to production, you probably want to run this script, which I can paste in the chat. And what this will do is deploy Rasa X to a server. So let me pause there, take some questions before we start to take a look at Rasa X together. Deploy Rasa X to a server. So let me pause there, take some questions before we start to take a look at Rasa X together. Okay, this stream is just a little behind, so that's cool. All right, so what I want to do now is for you to install Rasa X, let me just paste this command right here. Try to copy that command and also copy, paste it in text edit or something like that because you don't want to have any formatting errors or issues. So go ahead and do that. That's a very quick way to install Rasa X in your browser. And then that script will print the URL to access Rasa X. So in your terminal, you're going to see the URL to access your Rasa X. You'll also take a look at your password or whatever you need. But if you wanted to install it in local mode, I'm going to paste some instructions here in the chat also for you to be able to do that. Okay. And what you want to do for that is you'll go through the commands, which is to pip install Rasa X on your local machine. And then start Rasa X by running the command Rasa X. And that should open a browser to a local host. So you're going to want to follow instructions there to share your bot in local mode. If you wanted to share it in local mode, you're going to have to do that using ngrok. But if you just wanted to do some local testing yourselves, just follow the instructions. You should be able to get a Rasa X in local mode up and running pretty quickly. Okay. So as you try to do that together, I want to walk through what we can do within Rasa X. I already have a chatbot ready to go here. And one of the first things you could do is, talk to your bot, right? And you can also basically share your bot. This generates a link that I can send to anyone. I can send it to friends, colleagues, clients, whatever, and have them talk to my assistant and try it out. So when someone clicks the link, they see a very simple chat UI, something like this, but they're not going to see all of these things here. And that's a really great way to test your assistant early on. It gives users a realistic looking chat interface to talk to without needing to go through the process of connecting to a messaging channel on the live server. So why don't I start to have a conversation with my assistant here as I wait for some of y'all to install Rasa X if you want. If not, you can just take a look at what I'm doing. So this is an example financial banking assistant. It's also open source on Rasa. If you wanted to deploy this financial banking assistant, you can do so, and it's going to give you a really nice way to, stand up a financial banking bot, add to it, build on top of it. So take a look at that starter pack. So this bot can do things like track my spending, pay a credit card bill, transfer money to people. It also has the ability to hand off to a human agent if I wanted to do that. So what I can do is say something like transfer some money to people, right? So I can say I want to transfer money. It's going to ask me to who, right? And then let's say I want to transfer some money to John. And then it's going to ask me for how much money I want to transfer. So note that within Rasa X, you do have the ability when you're just talking to your bot in interactive learning, you might be familiar with doing this on the command line. You can actually correct what the bot says. But, in Rasa X, it's also pretty similar and in fact easier. So you could just hover over this and try to correct this. If the bot didn't respond with how much money do you want to transfer, if it responded with something that was not correct, you could go ahead and correct that right there. You can also take a look at the slots that it's filling and the next predicted action, which is to listen to my input. That looks right to me. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, the money that I want to transfer. It's going to ask me for a confirmation, and clicking on this button, rich text input will just execute that, and it's, successfully transfer that money to this person. So I can also do things like switch context within a conversation and maybe introduce some interruptions, because a level 3 assistant is supposed to do that, right? So if I say, hey, I want to transfer some money, and I say, actually, I want to do something else, it should be able to stop what it was doing before, handle that particular context switch or correction or whatever, and then go back to the main task at hand. So I can say something like, I want to transfer money to Percy, let's say. Oh, so I wasn't able to recognize that. So let's do maybe a caps and try to correct that assumption later on. So how much money do I want to transfer? That looks right. Let's say I switch context by saying I actually want to pay off my bank account first. And let's say my current balance, if there is a current balance, right? I'm going to schedule that today. Right. So I want to go ahead and schedule that payment for today. And so as you can see, it handled that particular sub dialogue and then went back to the main task, which was to go about, transferring money. So let's say I want to transfer that, which we've already seen before. And yes, go ahead and do that. Okay. So, test your assistant. Ideally, you have other people testing your assistant, and then you can actually take a look at the next step, which is review. Take a look at conversations. So I have a lot of conversations coming in from today, from yesterday and the day before. So if this is something that you wanted to do, review conversations in Rasa X, try to figure out a way to do that every week. Or if your assistant is in production and you have lots of live users, lots of conversations happening every day, then it makes sense to review those conversations every day and have a routine where you start your day with reviewing conversations, fixing them, and so forth. So first of all, in the conversations tab, what I can see is I can take a look at all of the conversations I have coming in. And there's two important uses for this screen. After you take a look at conversations you have coming in, you can also take a look at some of these filters that I can apply to narrow down a subset of conversations I want to take a look at. For example, I can filter out conversations where the out of scope intent was detected, right? Or I can take a look at conversations where maybe the confidence wasn't that high. And I want to take a look at conversations with a low confidence that helps me understand what's going wrong and how I can correct it. I can also take a look at maybe conversations with how many times it was handed off to a human agent, and see if the bot can do anything, improve customer service so that that doesn't happen as often and we're still able to automate as many conversations as possible. So another thing I can do, apart from filters, is that I can use these conversations to create new story data for my bot. So let's say I see an interesting conversation like what we just did here, where we transferred money, and then before doing that, we wanted to pay off a credit card bill. Like if it wasn't able to handle that, right, and I don't have a training example like that already in my training data, I can use these end-to-end conversations and export it to my stories.md file. I can just copy this conversation over to interactive learning, make any corrections that are needed, and then I can save this story right here. And it will become like an end-to-end story. So it's a really easy way to come up with new stories, because when you're building a bot, I'm sure you come up with like 5 or 10 stories that handle some basic happy pats. But this way you can actually have a pretty interesting conversation with your assistant, save that story, and have it become part of your training data. So the next step I can do, apart from conversations, is head over to NLU inbox within Rasa X, right? And then I can do the next step, which is annotate. Every user message that comes in goes to the NLU inbox for processing. This is where you can begin to take a look at the sentence and the predicted intent and confidence. This is where you can annotate any new NLU examples and save those messages. So, some of these look correct to me, but if you wanted to see that, this doesn't really mean anything, but it was predicted as the check receipts intent. So that's probably not useful. So what we could do is come up with, create a new intent out of scope, or add like out of scope, right? And then correct that prediction right here. I can also take a look to see when and why this was said, so I can understand the context a little bit better. And so that's a useful way to take a look at the sentence and the predicted intent and confidence. Correct it if it looks correct, right? That looks correct to me. When the user said cancel, it predicted goodbye, so that also looks correct to me. Same thing with wanting to transfer money. And so this, you're continuing to correct predictions or continuing to make changes and save it directly in the browser in Rasa X. So the next step is to push all of this training data that you keep correcting, where you correct the model's predictions and whatever, where you save end-to-end stories as training data. The next step is to push your training data to Git. Rasa X actually connects to your, it can connect with a remote Git repository using a feature called integrated version control. And that creates a continuous workflow for making updates to your assistant, all the way from annotating new messages that come in, to saving those changes in Git, to training a new model, and kicking off automated tests when you're ready to send those changes to production. So connecting it with a remote Git repository using version control is one of those ways that you can follow best practices and also get ready for production and coming up with a way to automate this process. You can also use an API to automatically tag conversations, right? Or add tags manually as you need it. And you also have a way to turn these successful conversations into new end-to-end tests. Let's take a look at training. So you have your NLU. Within your NLU inbox, you also have a way to correct your responses. So you take a look at utter, account balance, and the bot's responses, your balances, and it pulls that information, right, dynamically. And if you want to say utter ask back to transact, this is what it's going to say. Would you like to go back to the transaction search now? So you can go ahead and update these responses. This is a way to outsource responses, so that way you're not having to change the code each time. You can just do that right in the UI. And your stories is where you can write new stories, or like we talked about, save your stories right here and add them. You can also tweak the configuration if you want, but you'll have to retrain and restart, Rasa again. Same thing with domain. But Rasa X also gives you a way to check out analytics. Some of these analytics are definitely useful. They're very high-level stuff where you can take a look at number of user messages, overall user messages and stuff like that. New users, number of sessions per user, and average session length. So if you have some metrics around trying to reduce the session length or trying to increase number of users, this will give you like a high-level overview of what that looks like. And maybe, to increase users or to increase user retention, you want to make changes to your conversations. You want to add new scope and new capabilities and stuff like that. So this allows you to take a high-level view into how your bot's doing and make sure you're tracking those improvements and making improvements over time. So I'll take a look at some of those questions now. So if we create stories through that tool, wouldn't it create overfitting? Well, if you're taking a look at all of the user conversations coming in, by the way, that's a good question. So if you're taking a look at all of the user conversations coming in, and ideally you have, a fair amount of test users, and you also have a fair amount of actual live users talking to your assistant, the idea is that brings in a lot of diversity in terms of training data, different ways that real users are interacting with your assistant. So you continue to add those as end-to-end tests and also as end-to-end stories. So it wouldn't necessarily create overfitting in that case, because it gives your assistant a nice representative sample. So that way it's able to best predict what to do next, even though it hasn't seen a conversation like that or exactly like that. It'll take a look at that and say, well, this is sort of similar to my story that I already have. So the next best action is probably to respond with this, or probably to kick off an action and open a ticket on the user's behalf. So not necessarily. Hope that answers your question. So language management to Rasa X. Yeah, as of right now, that's a good question. As of right now, each of these language models each of these models within Rasa are per language, like you specify the language in your configuration setting, right? So maybe you could better clarify the question. If you mean, can I switch between languages using the same model, then, it's still one model, one language per model. So you're still going to have to specify the language that you want to use. Okay. How does Rasa X handle Git conflicts? Yeah. So as you can see here, I did have a couple of, when I went over to domain, I did have like a few inconsistencies detected. And it's also just like you would for regular Git connection. You can take a look at which branch you're connected to. You can discard any changes if you have any changes, stuff like that. And you can take a look at any kind of inconsistencies and fix them. So there is a way to identify stuff like that. If you're talking about maybe automatically resolving it, then it probably can't do that. But you do have a way to identify or take a look at any kind of Git conflicts and make whatever changes you need to. Okay. I'll wait to see if there are a couple more questions, but if not, we can probably go back to check if anyone needs any help with installing Rasa X. If not, then I'll continue to talk about what this looks like here. So another important feature that's kind of useful, at least in my opinion, is your ability to add synonyms. You have the normalized value for each entity, but then you also have different synonyms that you can take a look at and continue to add. People have different ways of saying credit, maybe. People have different ways of saying credit card, or people might have different ways of talking about Git, right? So you want to make sure that you're handling those synonyms too. Yeah, so overall, this is what Rasa X can do. I mean, it's a really great way to have a browser-based tool set that allows you to take a look at all of the conversations that you have coming in, share your assistant with people on your team. That way you're not always having to, talk to it on the command line or set up ngrok and, actually connect to a messaging channel, right? You can do so by just sharing it, and then you can view all of those conversations that you have coming in after you share it with guest testers, filter it by whatever you need that you think needs your attention. If you think you want to fix your accuracy, you can take a look at, stuff with very low confidence to see what's happening there. Maybe it's misannotating or misidentifying intents, or maybe it doesn't know how to handle that scenario just yet. You can also take a look at your channels if you have any, right? So filter the conversations that you have coming in, and then head over to NLU inbox and find a way to correct model predictions, to review them. If anything looks good, just correct them or change them, fix them, and then you can hit the train button right here and train it right in the UI, as opposed to having to test in command line and change it there. And yeah, you can connect to your remote Git repository via integrated version control. I'm connected to the master branch and the financial demo bot, but this is also a good way to follow CI/CD pipeline best practices and have your CI/CD pipeline up and running, because that's something you want to do before going to production. And there is a way for you to continue to add tests, test your assistant, but also add some tests as part of running your CI/CD pipeline. Okay. How do Rasa tests work in Rasa X, for example, those of end-to-end? And yeah, I think we talked just a little bit about how the tests work. I mean, there is a way for you to add these conversations as end-to-end tests, right? But also when you're trying to build your chatbot application, be sure to add unit tests for each block of code. Try to get 80-20 coverage, as is the best practice. You can also try to add functional tests and integration tests and so forth. Okay, so how does Rasa X handle lookup tables, regex, and other entity extractor tools? So, I mean, that's something that you try to do within Rasa open source when you're trying to build it, you know? Here you can take a look at your configuration. And if, for instance, you're using a regex featureizer, right, or something like that, you can take a look at what you've done here, maybe tweak your pipeline configuration. You know, we're using count vectors, featureizers, word level, and at the character level, that's why you see that twice. We're using the entity synonym mapper, you know, duckling extractors and so forth. But that's something that you would set and configure in your pipeline configuration itself. There is a way, you know, for you to do that here, and then you can save the changes. But it's you can also do that within Rasa open source, like when you're actually open up your command line or open up your IDE and do it there. So yeah, I mean, it handles it in a way that Rasa open source also handles it, but there's no like, you know, Rasa X is still a browser-based tool that allows you to do CDD, that allows you to maybe outsource responses, change responses, tweak them, and then train them right in the UI without you having to change your code each time. But like handling lookup tables in the way that you want to, or regex, whether it's for NLU or dialog management, adding other entity extractor tools, maybe Spacey, you know, duckling, or what have you, is still something that you would set within your code, if that makes sense. If you need to install external dependencies and custom actions, how do you do that if you want to add extra services like duckling extractor? So if you have custom actions that involve maybe calling an API to figure out someone's like, you know, credit card details or something like that, or calling an API to, maybe you want to, you know, integrate with ServiceNow, right, through a REST API. If you wanted to add external dependencies, you know, that's something that you would do in your code itself, maybe not in Rasa X. So like, you know, in your actions.py file, in your, you could create like, you know, the help desk assistant starter pack, if you wanted to take advantage of that, has a ServiceNow integration out of the box. So, you know, you do have a ServiceNow Python file where you could add in some other details. So if you wanted to do that, you would ideally do that in your actions.py file. And if you wanted to add extra, you know, extractors or language-specific extractors or something like that, or duckling for dates and times like you mentioned, you can do that in your pipeline configuration itself. You can make changes to that here. And because you're connected to Git, you know, you can save those changes, right? But you can also do that within your domain file itself. Are you going to implement a Python interpreter to develop the custom actions through Rasa X? So, I mean, Rasa X does have a Python SDK that allows you to very seamlessly and very easily, you know, implement custom actions, build on top of custom actions, make some more. We actually teach a course called Advanced Custom Actions, which is going to be on Udemy soon too, something that I taught a couple of weeks ago, where we go through how you can leverage and extend the Rasa SDK to continue to build upon your own custom actions. Through Rasa X, that's a good question. We'll have to take a look at our roadmap and get back to you on that. Okay. All right, cool. So I think that was it for questions. I mean, if anyone has any difficulty trying to install Rasa X or something like that, let me know. Happy to go through that. But yeah. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Raphael. All right, cool. So I think that was it for questions. I mean, if anyone has any difficulty trying to install Rasa X or something.
Stop my YouTube. Yeah, it was very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Mady. I think we have done various interesting questions. I would like to see more participants in this question answer meetup, but I think it was very, very interesting to us. I have learned a lot myself. So I've been talking with other partners and they said the same. So thank you very much. We would like to see you in the next times in new meetups in the future. So we will be very glad to take you here.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun and happy to come back and chat with y'all whenever.
Thank you very much. So, bueno, esto fue todo por hoy. No sé si tenéis alguna otra pregunta, la podéis dejar aquí en el chat de YouTube. Creo que no sé si nos dará tiempo porque Mady está muy ocupada y tendrá que irse, pero no sé si te dará tiempo. Si ponéis alguna otra pregunta, no, pues no. Pues nos vemos en el próximo Meetup, que esperamos que pueda ser en el próximo mes o en 2 meses. Dependerá de cómo avanza este tema del coronavirus y que nos dejen, porque nos gustaría reunirnos y encontrarnos todos, aunque sigamos haciendo sesiones online. Así que, pues muchas gracias a todos por estar aquí. Espero que hayáis disfrutado y hayáis aprendido mucho con Mady. So, Mady, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.